In the darkness of a winter night in 1943, in the mountains of occupied France, a group of resistance fighters waits in absolute silence. They have no elaborate military uniforms, nor the sophisticated weaponry of regular armies. What they carry in their hands is something that many professional soldiers would have despised at first glance. A weapon that appears to have been hurriedly assembled in a makeshift workshop. A coarse metal tube, with rough appearance and minimalist design that defies any traditional concept of military weaponry. However, this simple weapon, this seemingly primitive creation, has become the most powerful symbol of European resistance against the occupation. This is the story of the Sten machine gun, the weapon that changed the course of secret warfare in occupied Europe. Before we continue with this fascinating story, please subscribe to the channel and leave in the comments the time you are watching this video. Your participation helps our work continue to bring important stories like this. To truly understand the revolutionary impact of this weapon, we need to go back in time to the dark days of 1940. Europe was on fire. German forces had advanced across the continent with a speed and ferocity that shocked the world. France had fallen in a matter of weeks. Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway were under German control. Britain was isolated, standing alone against the most powerful war machine the world had ever seen. And at that desperate moment, when the German invasion of England itself seemed imminent, British military leaders confronted a difficult reality. During the evacuation of Dunkirk, the British Army had been forced to abandon the vast majority of its heavy equipment on the beaches of France. Thousands of rifles, hundreds of artillery pieces, armored vehicles, ammunition and weaponry of all kinds had been left behind. The British soldiers had been rescued, their lives preserved through a heroic evacuation effort, but the war material had been lost. And now, with the threat of invasion looming over the English Channel, England needed to rearm her army with desperate urgency. Weapons stockpiles were critically low. Traditional weapons factories, with their meticulous and time-consuming manufacturing processes, simply could not produce enough weaponry quickly enough. It was an existential crisis that demanded radical solutions. It was in this context of desperation and urgent need that two men, Major Reginald Shepherd and Harold Turpin, began working on a revolutionary project at the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield. Create a submachine gun that could be mass-produced quickly and with as few resources as possible. The weapon needed to be effective in close combat, reliable enough for military use, but above all, it needed to be extremely simple to manufacture. There was no time for elegance or refinement. There were no resources for complex manufacturing processes. What was needed was pure functionality, stripped of any superfluous element. Shepherd and Turpin approached the challenge with a radically pragmatic mindset. They studied the existing designs of automatic weapons, particularly the German MP-40 machine gun, and identified the essential elements that made a submachine gun work. Then, methodically, they eliminated everything that was not absolutely necessary. The result was a design that shocked the traditionalists of the military establishment. The weapon they created looked more like an assembly of industrial plumbing pipes than a suitable military weapon. The main body was literally a simple steel pipe. The cable was another pipe welded at an angle. The charger fed through the side, an unusual configuration that many considered strange. The butt could be metal or wood, depending on the materials available. There was no polished finish, no decorative engravings, no traditional military aesthetics. It was brutally functional and absolutely devoid of ornamentation. When the prototypes were presented to military officers, initial reactions ranged from skepticism to outright hostility. Officers accustomed to the British armament tradition, with magnificently crafted Lee-Enfield rifles and weapons that were true works of craftsmanship, looked at this metal tube with barely disguised disdain. Some called it a plumbing pipe. Others said it looked like a gun made by an amateur blacksmith in a backyard workshop. How could something so crude and primitive be suitable for soldiers of the British Empire? But when the gun was tested in the firing range, aesthetic objections began to fade. Sten worked. She fired 9mm parabellum ammunition, the same caliber used by German forces, which meant captured ammunition could be used. The firing rate was approximately 500 rounds per minute, suitable for close combat. The effective range was limited about 50 to 70 meters, But for the type of combat that was anticipated in urban defense or guerrilla operations, it was more than enough. And most impressive of all was the economics of its production. While a traditional weapon could require tens of hours of work from a skilled gunsmith, the Sten could be produced in approximately 5 hours using workers with minimal training. The cost of production was extraordinarily low, a fraction of the price of conventional weapons. This meant that England could produce these weapons by the thousands, equipping not only its regular army, but also the territorial defense units that were being hastily formed to resist the expected invasion. The name Sten was derived from the initials of its creators, Shepherd and Turpin, combined with the first 2 letters of Enfield, the place where it was developed. Mass production began in 1941, and soon British factories were producing these weapons at an impressive rate. But it was not only the official weapons factories that were involved. Small workshops, garages, industrial workshops of all kinds were recruited for the production effort. The simplicity of the design meant that virtually any installation with basic metallurgy capability could produce components. The pieces were then sent to assembly centers where they were combined into functional weapons. It was mass production on a scale the country had never experienced before, a veritable national arms effort. Initially, Stens were distributed to British Army units and territorial defense forces. The crude appearance of the weapon continued to be a source of jokes and derogatory comments. Nicknames proliferated. Some called it a lead pipe, others sewage pipe. There were those who said that the weapon appeared to have been designed by someone who had never seen a suitable weapon before. The feel of holding the Sten was radically different from traditional weapons. It was light, almost surprisingly light. The balance was unusual due to the side loader. The firing mechanism was simple to the point of rudeness. There was no tactile refinement of more sophisticated weapons. But there was something else that the soldiers quickly discovered. The Sten had a personality of its own, and was not always a pleasant personality. The weapon had a reputation for being temperamental. The side loader, while facilitating production, also created points of failure. Dirt or debris could easily enter the mechanism. The loader needed to be inserted with specific care, and many novice soldiers found the hard way that excessive force or incorrect angle could result in jamming. There were stories, some true and some possibly exaggerated by time, of Stens accidentally firing when they fell or were handled abruptly. The safety of the weapon was basic and required constant attention. Soldiers quickly learned that Sten required constant respect and care. It was not a weapon that forgave negligence or careless handling. Despite these peculiarities, or perhaps partly because of them, a strange relationship developed between British soldiers and their Stens. It was a relationship based not on admiration for aesthetics or pride in weaponry, but on something deeper and more pragmatic. Sten was a survivor. It could be abused, mistreated, exposed to conditions that would destroy more delicate weapons, and yet, with basic maintenance, it would continue to function. Soldiers fighting in the North African desert found that the simplicity of the Sten design was a significant advantage. Sand and dust that would clog more complex mechanisms could be easily cleared from Sten. In the mud and rain of Northern Europe, where more refined weapons failed, Sten kept firing. It was, in essence, the weapon of the common soldier. There was no pretension in it. There was no false elegance. It was a practical tool for difficult tasks, and in this role she excelled. But the true story of Sten, the reason it became legendary, is not primarily in the hands of British regular soldiers. The real saga of this weapon began when the British strategists realized that they had in their hands something much more valuable than simply a cheap machine gun. They had the perfect weapon for the secret war being waged in the shadows of occupied Europe. They had the ideal tool to arm the resistance. Across German-occupied Europe, from Paris to Warsaw, from Oslo to Athens, resistance movements were forming. They were composed of ordinary men and women who refused to accept German domination. Factory workers, teachers, farmers, students, people from all layers of society who decided to fight in any way possible against the occupiers. But these resistance fighters faced immense challenges. They had no access to military arsenals. They could not simply order weapons through official channels. They needed weapons that could be surrendered secretly, that could be hidden easily, that could be used by people without formal military training, and that could be kept operational in makeshift conditions. Sten met all these requirements almost perfectly. Its simplicity meant that people with no prior experience with weapons could learn to use it quickly. Its modular design meant that it could be disassembled into components that could be hidden separately, reducing the risk of discovery during German searches. Its ease of maintenance meant that even in makeshift hideouts with basic tools, the weapon could be kept in working condition. And perhaps more importantly, the fact that it could use captured German ammunition meant that resistance groups did not rely solely on risky air supplies for their ammunition needs. The British Special Operations Executive, known as SOE, the secret agency tasked with conducting sabotage and supporting resistance movements in occupied Europe, quickly recognized the potential of Sten. They began to include these weapons in airdrops to resistance groups across Europe. At night, under the roar of low-flying British planes, parachutes descended over isolated fields in France, the Netherlands, Poland, Norway. These launches contained explosives, radio equipment, cash, fake documents, and increasingly Stens. For the resistance fighters who opened these containers, the Sten represented something more than simply a weapon. It was physical proof that England had not forgotten them, that the fighting was going on, that they were not alone in their resistance. The first reactions of resistance fighters to Sten were often similar to those of British soldiers. The crude appearance of the weapon caused surprise and sometimes disappointment. Many expected to receive impressive military weaponry, something that looked like the weapons that German soldiers carried. Instead, they were given what appeared to be rudimentarily assembled metal pipes. But this first impression quickly changed when the weapon was used in real operations. In ambushes of German convoys, Sten proved its worth. In attacks on military installations, in sabotage operations, in clashes on the streets of occupied cities, the weapon has demonstrated its operational effectiveness. In occupied France, the French resistance, known as the Maquis, became one of the most prolific users of Sten. In the forests and mountains of rural France, groups of maquisards hid, planning operations against the German occupiers. The Sten became a characteristic weapon of these fighters. They learned its peculiarities, developed techniques to keep it running in the harshest conditions, and used it to significant effect. There were stories circulating among resistance groups about private operations where Sten had proven its worth. A successful ambush where a small group of maquisards, armed mainly with Stens, had managed to overcome a much larger German patrol. An audacious attack on a train carrying military supplies, a prisoner rescue operation where Sten had provided the necessary capability to complete the mission. What made Sten particularly valuable to the resistance was its suitability for the specific type of combat they waged. Resistance fighters did not fight conventional battles in open fields. They could not afford prolonged confrontations where they would be at great numerical disadvantage and weaponry against the regular German forces. Instead, their strength was in rapid and surprise attacks, sudden ambushes, sabotage, and then rapid disappearance before German reinforcements could arrive. For this type of operation, Sten was ideal. Its compact size allowed it to be hidden under coats or loaded into bags. Its short-range fire capacity was significant, and its simplicity meant that when an operation was over, the weapon could be quickly disassembled and the components hidden in separate locations. But Sten was not just a military tool. She became a powerful psychological symbol. For the Germans, the proliferation of these weapons among resistance groups was a source of growing concern. The presence of Stens indicated that the Allies were actively supporting and arming the resistance movements. Each Sten captured by the Germans was evidence that their occupation was being actively contested, that there was an organized network of opposition receiving outside support. The German occupying forces responded with increasingly severe measures. The discovery of a Sten posed a grave danger to those involved and their communities. Possession of a Sten became an extraordinarily dangerous, but also extraordinarily significant act of defiance. For the civilian populations under occupation, the mere existence of the Sten in the hands of the resistance was a message of hope. When news circulated that the local resistance had carried out a successful operation, when rumors spoke of weapons being parachuted at night, when occasionally a Sten was seen briefly before being hidden again, these were indications that resistance was real, that fighting continued, that liberation remained possible. Paradoxically, it is a symbol of hope and challenge. As the war progressed and the Allies began planning for the liberation of Europe, the importance of armed resistance grew dramatically. In the months leading up to D-Day, the Allied invasions of Normandy in June 1944, there was massive intensification of airdrops of weapons to resistance groups across France. Thousands of Stens have been sent. The goal was to create a secret army that could carry out large-scale sabotage when the invasion began, disrupting German communications, destroying supply lines, and generally causing logistical difficulties behind enemy lines. And this plan has had significant success. When the Allies landed in Normandy, the French resistance, armed mainly with Stens and explosives supplied by the British, launched a campaign of sabotage that had a considerable impact on German operations. Railway lines were interrupted. Bridges were damaged. German trains faced ambushes. Communication facilities were attacked. German forces found that they could not move freely through France. Each road could hide ambush. Each turn could hide resistance fighters armed with Stens. The cumulative effect was significant, delaying German reinforcements, causing confusion, and materially contributing to the success of the Allied campaign. In other occupied countries, similar stories unfolded. In Poland, the Polish Domestic Army, one of the largest and best organized resistance forces in Europe, made extensive use of British-supplied Stens. During the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, when the Polish resistance attempted to liberate the capital before the arrival of Soviet forces, Stens were among the main weapons used by the insurgents. Although the uprising ended with great losses and severe consequences for Warsaw, the courage of Polish fighters, many of them armed with Stens, entered history as a testament to human resistance and the desire for freedom. In Greece, where different resistance groups fought against the German occupiers, the Sten became the common weapon of mountain guerrillas. In the mountains of Greece, on terrain where conventional military maneuvers were difficult, Sten proved to be particularly suitable for guerrilla operations. In Norway, where resistance forces conducted notable sabotage operations, including the famous attack on German heavy water facilities essential to the Nazi nuclear development program, Stens provided the defense and combat capability when needed. Throughout occupied Europe, the story was similar. The crude British weapon became an essential tool of resistance. But the history of Sten also has a more complex and morally ambiguous chapter. The simplicity of the weapon that made it so suitable for mass production and use by the resistance also meant that it could be copied relatively easily. And copied it was on all sides of the conflict. The German forces themselves, despite possessing their own submachine machine guns, recognized the practical virtues of Sten. They captured many of these weapons during anti-resistance operations and redistributed them to their own troops, particularly to units fighting guerrillas where light and high-volume weaponry was advantageous. But the Germans went beyond simple capture. They produced their own copies of Sten. In factories in Germany and the occupied territories, German versions of Sten were manufactured. These copies were technically similar to the British original, though often with minor modifications based on German design preferences. The existence of German Stens has created confusing situations on the battlefield. In close combat, in dim light, it was difficult to immediately distinguish a British Sten from a German copy. There were unfortunate incidents when soldiers, hearing the characteristic sound of Sten firing, incorrectly assumed the origin of the fire, either from German forces using captured or copied versions of the weapon. The ability to copy the Sten also meant that it proliferated beyond official control in Yugoslavia, where party forces led by Josip Broz Tito fought German occupiers and rival groups. Makeshift workshops began producing their own versions of the Sten. Using plans obtained through the Allies and locally available materials, Yugoslav artisans created functional copies of the weapon. Quality varied considerably. Some were almost as good as the British originals. Others had limited reliability. But the fact that they could be produced locally, without reliance on irregular airdrops, was a significant strategic advantage. This local production capacity was not unique to the Yugoslavs. Throughout Europe, whenever there were workshops with basic metallurgical capacity and access to the plans, versions of Sten were produced. It was a weapon that had escaped the control of its creators, proliferating through all sides of the conflict. After the war ended in 1945, many expected the Sten to quickly disappear. After all, it was the product of urgent wartime need, created under extreme pressures of time and resources. With the return of peace, it would certainly be replaced by more refined and better designed weapons. But the history of Sten was far from over. In fact, a new chapter was just beginning. The post-war world proved to be almost as turbulent as the war years. The British Empire was disintegrating. Independence movements emerged across Africa and Asia. Colonial liberation wars were fought. The Cold War began, bringing proxy clashes between Western and Soviet blocs. And in many of these conflicts, Sten has reappeared. British forces fighting in Malaya against communist insurgents in the 1950s found that Sten, with its suitability for jungle combat, remained a valuable weapon. In the Suez Crisis in 1956, Stens were still in use. During the Troubles in Northern Ireland, which began in the late 1960s and continued for decades, Stens captured or obtained through clandestine channels appeared in the hands of paramilitaries on both sides of the conflict. The weapon that had been created to fight Nazi occupation was now used in sectarian conflict that deeply affected Northern Ireland. Internationally, Sten has spread even more widely. During the founding of the State of Israel in 1948 and the wars that followed, Stens were among the weapons used by Israeli forces. They had been obtained through various channels. Some were British surpluses, others had been smuggled, and some were even produced locally in clandestine workshops before independence. In Africa, as nations fought for independence, Stens provided by various sources appeared in the hands of both colonial forces and liberation movements. In Asia, from Indochina to Indonesia, the weapon has proliferated. It had become a permanent part of the global arsenal of small arms. Decades after its creation, Stens still appeared in conflict zones around the world. They were seen in African civil wars in the 1970s and 1980s. They have occasionally appeared in Middle Eastern conflicts. Its simplicity and durability meant that even weapons produced in the 1940s could still function when well maintained. In certain circles of collectors and historians of weaponry, Sten has developed near-cult status. Those who appreciated military history recognized its significance. It was a weapon that had been designed under conditions of national existential crisis and had exceeded all expectations. When we retrospectively examine the history of Sten, several profound lessons emerge. First, and perhaps most obvious, is that effectiveness does not require elegance. Sten has never won design awards. She was never celebrated for her aesthetics. Many who used it complained about its peculiarities and irregular temperament. She provided fire capacity when and where it was needed, in sufficient quantities to make a material difference in the course of the war. His success was the triumph of pragmatism over perfectionism. In a context where the perfect was the enemy of the good, where waiting for the ideal solution would mean having no solution at all, Sten offered adequate functionality in sufficient volume to change realities on the battlefield. The second lesson is about innovation under pressure. Sten did not emerge from a long-term weapons development program with a generous budget and unlimited time. It arose from crisis, from desperate need, from the clear recognition that traditional methods were inadequate for the challenge faced. Shepard and Turpin had no luxury of gradual refinement through multiple iterations over years. They had to create functional solution quickly, using limited resources. The fact that they succeeded in doing so, and that their creation proved to be not only adequate but remarkably successful, testifies to what can be achieved when need meets creative ingenuity uninhibited by traditional convention. The third lesson involves democratizing force. Sten allowed ordinary people, civilians without formal military training, to become effective combatants. The training required to use the weapon was minimal. Its operation was simple enough that virtually anyone with basic intelligence and a small amount of instruction could learn to use it. This had profound implications. It meant that resistance against occupation was no longer the exclusive domain of military professionals. Teachers could lead sabotage attacks. Students could participate in ambushes. Sten, in a sense, democratized resistance warfare. It has placed in the hands of occupied populations tangible means of struggle against their oppressors. This democratization has brought both hope and tragedy. The hope lay in the ability to resist, to fight, not to passively accept domination. The tragedy was at the high cost of this resistance. Occupation forces responded to armed resistance with severe measures in an attempt to suppress resistance movements. And the resistance forces themselves, despite their courage, often faced great risks and significant losses. The life of a resistance fighter was dangerous in the extreme. Many who took sten to fight for the liberation of their countries did not survive to see this liberation achieved. The weapon gave them the ability to fight, but could not protect them from the consequences of that choice. The fourth lesson relates to unintended legacies. The creators of sten designed it for a specific purpose in a specific context. Second World War resistance against Nazi occupation. But once the weapon existed, once its plans were widespread, once it had been produced by the millions and spread across entire continents, it took on a life of its own. It was used in conflicts that its creators never anticipated. It was employed for both just and questionable causes. It has been copied, modified, replicated by countless groups and nations. This phenomenon is not unique to sten, of course. All military technologies share this characteristic of proliferation and unintentional use. But sten is particularly clear case due to its fundamental simplicity that facilitated unauthorized copying and production. The creators of the weapon inadvertently contributed to the decades-long conflict landscape that followed the Second World War. There is also a human dimension in the history of sten that should not be forgotten. Behind the production statistics, behind the technical analysis of your design, behind the strategic assessments of your impact, there are thousands of individual stories. The British soldier who carried sten through the Italian campaign, complaining about her faults but depending on her in combat. The French resistance fighter who had sten disassembled under floorboards of his home, knowing that discovery would mean grave danger to him and his family. The Polish woman who learned to disarm and reassemble sten in the dark, preparing for insurrection that would require immense sacrifice. The Greek guerrilla in the mountains for whom the sten was his only protection against German patrols. The Allied paratrooper who jumped over Normandy carrying sten along with his standard equipment. Each of these weapons that was produced, and millions of them were produced, passed through the hands of real individuals with real fears, real hopes, real lives that were shaped by conflict in which they were involved. For many who carried it, sten was more than just a tool. She was a constant companion in conditions of extreme danger. There was a personal relationship that was developing. Soldiers gave names to their stens. They learned the specific peculiarities of their individual weapon, as each sten had small idiosyncrasies that distinguished it from other seemingly identical ones. They developed personal techniques for dealing with gun crazes, specific ways of inserting the charger, particular angles of holding the gun to minimize jamming. This intimacy between combatant and weapon is not unique to sten, but the temperamental personality of the weapon might make this relationship even more intense. You couldn't just take sten and use it negligently. She demanded attention, care, respect. And in return, for those who learned to work with its quirks, it provided the operational capability that could make a critical difference in combat situations. The psychological experience of using sten in combat also deserves consideration. For regular British soldiers, there was always an element of awareness about the improbable nature of their weapon. They knew they were carrying what many considered an inferior weapon. They listened to the disparaging comments of American allies who possessed more impressive-looking weapons. There was a certain sense of inferiority associated with the weapon. However, this sentiment was counterbalanced by pragmatic pride. Sten was a British weapon, created in the time of the nation's dire need. It represented British resilience, the ability to improvise and persevere even when resources were limited. For resistance fighters, psychology was different but equally complex. The sten was a tangible symbol of connection with the Allies, especially with England, who continued to fight when much of Europe had fallen. Receiving sten on airdrop was a moment of deep emotional significance. It was an affirmation that their struggle mattered, that they were not alone, that liberation was possible. The weapon became an almost sacred object, treated with reverence not only for its practical value but for everything it symbolically represented. There is also an interesting philosophical question raised by sten about the nature of design and functionality. Traditional military design aesthetics have always valued a certain elegance, a sense that well-designed weapons should not only work well but also look good. There was a notion that adequate weaponry for soldiers of a civilized nation should reflect the sophistication of that civilization. Sten fundamentally challenged this presumption. She demonstrated that functionality could be completely divorced from traditional aesthetics, that something could look crude and primitive but still be profoundly effective. This was a humiliating lesson for those invested in traditional notions of military excellence. It was also liberating, demonstrating that extreme circumstances require radical reevaluation of priorities. When national survival is at stake, luxuries like aesthetics become irrelevant. As we approach the present, the physical presence of Sten has decreased, but its historical presence remains robust. Military museums around the world display examples of these weapons, often accompanied by explanations of their historical significance. Historical military weaponry collectors look for specimens in good condition, although functional Stens are now highly regulated in most countries due to gun control laws. Historians continue to study Sten's role in the Second World War and subsequent conflicts, debating nuances of its impact and significance. Documentaries are produced exploring its history. Books are written examining technical aspects of their design or human aspects of their use. The weapon that many considered ugly and inadequate became the object of continuous historical fascination. Veterans who carried Sten, the number steadily decreasing with the passage of time, often express complicated relationship with the weapon when interviewed about their war experiences. Few express love for Sten. Many still complain about their flaws and quirks decades later. But almost everyone recognizes its importance. They admit that despite all their flaws, Sten was there when they needed it. It worked when they needed it. She kept them alive. And this is perhaps the most honest and meaningful assessment any military weapon can receive. Not that it was perfect, not that it was loved, but that when it mattered, when lives were at stake, it fulfilled its function. There is also strange continuity in the history of Sten that connects different generations and different conflicts. Weapon created to fight fascism in Europe of the 1940s appeared decades later in completely different conflicts. It appeared in the hands of national liberation movements fighting against colonialism. It appeared in civil wars where the issues were totally different from those of the Second World War. This continuity testifies to the weapon's physical durability, certainly, but it also testifies to something deeper about the nature of weapons as political tools. Once created, once disseminated around the world, weapons develop their own trajectories independent of the intentions of their creators. The purpose-designed Sten has served hundreds of different purposes over decades. This is an uncomfortable reality about military technology. It does not remain contained within the contexts for which it was created. It proliferates, it is reappropriated, it is used for purposes that no one has foreseen. For the common civilian population in occupied Europe during World War II, who never held Sten and never participated in resistance operations, the weapon still had significance. Their existence was known through rumors and occasionally through direct encounters when travelers occasionally glimpsed resistance fighters. For these people, Sten represented the possibility of resistance, the idea that occupation was not permanent, the implicit promise that eventually liberation would come. In countries where the population was mostly passive, simply trying to survive the hardships of the occupation, the existence of armed resistance, even small, provided psychological hope. They knew there were those who fought, and this meant that total submission was not inevitable, that there were alternatives to collaboration or passivity. The history of Sten also intersects with stories of great courage and sacrifice. Pilots who flew dangerous missions over occupied territory to launch containers with Stens and other supplies, many of them never returning from their missions. The SOE agents who parachuted into occupied France carrying Stens and other weapons to train and equip resistance groups, knowing that if captured they would face severe consequences. The very resistance fighters who risked not just their own lives but the lives of their families by hiding these weapons and using them against occupiers. These stories of individual courage and sacrifice are woven through the technical history of the weapon. Sten is not merely an object of technical or historical interest. It is a marker of extraordinary human courage demonstrated under extreme circumstances. When we consider Sten's overall impact on the Second World War, we must be careful not to exaggerate or underestimate. No individual weapon does that. The defeat of Nazi Germany required massive combined Allied effort, involving millions of soldiers, vast amounts of equipment of all kinds, immense sacrifices, and campaigns on multiple fronts over several years. But within this broader context, Sten played a role that was genuinely significant. It provided a means of arming resistance movements on a scale that would otherwise have been impossible. It contributed to creating conditions that facilitated the eventual liberation of occupied Europe. She provided hope and fighting ability when both were desperately needed. In final consideration, the story of Sten is a story about adaptation, about doing the best with what you have, about finding solutions to seemingly insurmountable problems through unconventional thinking. It is a story that reminds us that effectiveness does not always come in elegant packages, that functionality matters more than appearance when circumstances are critical. It is a story about how necessity drives innovation in ways that peacetime rarely achieves. It is a story about the courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges with imperfect but sufficient tools. It's a story about how physical objects, even something as seemingly simple as a metal tube with a trigger mechanism attached, can become charged with deep historical and emotional significance. Sten was, in all respects, an unlikely weapon. Unlikely in its genesis, created under extreme pressure with minimal resources. Unlikely in its appearance, defying all aesthetic expectations of what a military weapon should look like. Unlikely in its success, overcoming initial skepticism to become one of the most produced and widely distributed weapons of the Second World War. However, this unlikely weapon has become, in many ways, the perfect symbol of its time. In an era of total war, when entire nations mobilized all available resources, when distinctions between home front and battlefield were blurred, when civilian populations became involved in conflict in unprecedented ways, the Sten represented democratization of warfare. It was a weapon of the people, hastily created, widely spread, used by professionals and amateurs, by soldiers and civilians, by those who fought in uniforms and those who fought in the shadows. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And in the end, when history was written, this ugly weapon, this improvised assembly of metal tubes, gained a permanent place in the annals of military history as a weapon that changed the face of resistance in occupied Europe. Sten teaches us that great achievements do not always come in grandiose forms, that victory can be achieved with simple tools in the hands of determined people, and that sometimes the most unlikely thing is exactly what is needed to change the course of history. May the Lord God bless all those who fought for freedom, those who sacrificed everything for a better world, and may we always remember the lessons that history teaches us about courage, sacrifice, and resistance against oppression.